Okay, once again, hello everyone. This is FIDE Master Victor Neustroyev. Today we are doing our next workshop, and this workshop is devoted to the attack with limited or with small forces. When we just have a few pieces, but we still can initiate the attack, and this attack will allow us to benefit. For example, we can checkmate the king, or instead we can focus on something else during the attack and, for example, capture the pawn on the other side of the board and or distract enemy pieces and promote. Okay, so let me see. Please let me know if the sound and video quality is good. It should be fine. I checked everything before we started. So people are joining. We will analyze 5 game fragments today. And before we start, so is there anything that you want to share, like any games, anything you want to say about attack with small forces? Okay, anyway, let's start. Let's start. And well, first, what you should understand. Well, all of you guys know that chess is a variable game. It's very rich. There are tons of positions. You can meet tons of positions where one or just two pieces can be stronger than several enemy pieces. For example, you can coordinate your rook and knight and deliver Arabian Mate or Anastasia's Mate. You can coordinate your rook and bishop and deliver a Morphy's Mate. Queen and knight can work together properly well. What else? The king, together with knight and the pawn in the endgame, can be quite strong and can create checkmate. So, what are we aiming for when we are doing the attack with limited forces? So, first of all, we are trying to create mating threats. Or we are looking for tactics which allows us to win material. Like I said, a pawn on the other side of the board. Sometimes we are looking for drawing combinations, like when we want to get a perpetual check or deliver a perpetual check, or when we want to like just repeat the position. Very often we want to distract enemy pieces and promote a pawn to a queen, like I said. What are these preconditions for the attack of with small or limited forces? This is the most important thing. So not in every game you should attack the enemy king if you have just a few pieces left. And, well, first, there should be some preconditions that you have to recognize, and once you are sure that you recognize them, then you may um, start the attack. For example, if the enemy king is vulnerable, then yes, you may have a chance to initiate the attack. What else? If your opponent's position consists of weaknesses, then yes, it still does make sense to attack the enemy king and maybe take advantage of these weaknesses. If you have far advanced passed pawns, or even if they are not passed pawns, if they are just far advanced, it does make sense because there can be tactics in the endgame which may allow you to promote this pawn later. So usually we attack with small forces in the middle game. Sometimes in the usually we do it in the end game, sometimes in the middle game. If we don't want to let our opponent to initiate the attack with limited forces on our king, we should keep our king safe. And our other pieces should be protected and do not interfere each other's activity. And of course, you have to pay attention to the enemy passed pawns. There are a lot of examples in books. Maybe you can find some on chess.com. So, what in order to learn attack with small forces, well, of course, except of attending this workshop, you have to work on endgame puzzles. So, for example, some tactical books. Maybe you can also find this feature on chess.com. So some tactical books consist of puzzles devoted to different tactical motives. And among them, there can be some endgame tactics. So learning endgame tactics will help you to get better with attack with limited forces. Okay, let's start. Let's start. So what do you think about this position? White is only one pawn up, but this pawn is actually a double pawn. If the queens are exchanged, it should be a draw. So there will be 1 versus 1 on the queen side and 3 versus 2 on the king side. But these three, well, these two pawns are doubled, so this is not a perfect pawn structure. But with the queens on the board, white has additional chances, and they can initiate the attack on the enemy king with just few pieces. Also, they may threaten to transpose the game to the queen endgame by exchanging the rooks, because the queen endgame can be winning. Of course, there is a risk of getting the perpetual check, but at the same time, if you exchange rooks with queens, you definitely have more chances to win. So, what do you think? What to start with? In this position, which move you should play? So you can type it in the chat. You can also unmute yourself and say it. Queen e6. Well, queen e6 is just a check, right? So, Hunter suggested queen e6. So, but if you play queen e6, don't you trade queens? And they said that the rook endgame should be drawish. How? Well, for example, like that. Well, b3 can be played. And if you play rook d3, they play this move. But it still should be a draw. Oh, maybe actually they can play this move, this, and then this. And this is how they win a pawn. So you still have to play b3. And well, if they take there, they may lose this pawn on b4. So maybe it's not a good strategy. That's why let's just play this move. Rook a3, the rook is tied down, and we can activate the king, and it should be a draw anyway. Fine. So queen g4. Well, oh, queen e7. Queen e7 to attack there. Yes, it is a possibility. For example, queen d6 then. And then it's not clear what we should do. Probably we should play queen back to g5 and keep the queens on the board. Queen g4 is a more natural move because, well, you attack the pawn as well as you add some pressure and you threaten to play this move. However, a rook e7 should be played accurately. Oh, black continues with b3 defending the pawn, and now rook e7 doesn't look good because of what? So who can tell me why rook e7 right now fails? Exactly, thanks. Because of queen d1. Rook e7 looks like a strong threat, but after queen d1 we have to trade queens, and again, this is a draw. They can play rook f2, and now they win the pawn anyway. That's why prophylaxis. King goes to the second rank. But queen f7, now rook e7 becomes impossible. Queen g5, there is a threat of capturing here, and the rook e7. Rook d7, what would you suggest? Let's improve our position step by step. So what white can do to make the position stronger, because I don't think that black can improve their position. They just have to stay and wait. Queen b5. What does queen b5 threaten with? Queen b5 threatens with queen b8, right? So probably if you play such a move, they are likely to react with h6. Rook e2. Rook e2 looks interesting, but too defensive. That's why f3, defending the pawn and trying to make the king's position more safe. So h6, queen retreats, rook d8, and g4, gaining space and creating some squares that obtaining which, occupying which with white pieces, white can improve their position. So the king is really safe on h3. King goes to h8, queen goes to b6, attacking there and putting pressure on b3. So now rook comes to d2. Still, it's not a mistake. Attacking there, so queen b8 check, king h7, and rook e8. So it's not a losing move, but such a move allows us to attack through the back rank. But what else could they do? What do you think? Because our next move can be rook a3 and we may win the pawn on b3. So they should have a counterplay. And in order to obtain this counterplay, they should do something with their pieces. So what do you think? Maybe delivering check is a good idea, but then king h3. So what do you think? Could black do anything else instead of rook d2? So b3 is an object of the attack. Maybe queen f4, rook b8? h5. Seems to be quite risky.
H5.
Right now the rook is hanging. Okay, so let's say they play, I don't know, queen f4, for example. g3 doesn't look possible because of rook d2, queen d2 checks. So king goes to h3. Now the rook moves to b8, for example, with a tempo. Queen e6. So with queen e6, you are still keeping pressure. You are doing this. If let's say, well, let's say in this position, queen e6, and they play h5. For example, if they play h5, I don't think it's a good move, but let's say it happens. Then I think you can win with rook e5, threatening to take there. So they take, you take, but this queen cannot deliver checks. The only check that I see is queen h6, but then rook h5. So that's why at this moment there is a weakness on b3 and there is a weakness of the back rank. That's why black is trying to find a draw with their pieces activity. Rook d2, queen b8 check, king goes to h7, and rook e8 threatening to chase the king away and try to checkmate the king on the open space. What do you think black should do? Okay, queen f3, this is what was played in the game. This is what Viktor Korchnoi played in the game against David Bernstein. And that was actually a critical mistake. So Korchnoi couldn't visualize why such a move is a mistake. So that's why you may experience similar problems with calculation of this line. But okay, if it's not queen f3, then what instead? Rook f2. What's the purpose of rook f2? Queen f6 with h5. Okay, queen f6 makes sense, but wait a sec. What did you prepare for this attack? So queen h4 is a threat. Yes, it is. So queen e8. No, I don't think this is a promising strategy. The king should be checkmated, for example. Like that, I'm threatening with this move. So rook d4 to stop at g3. And after king takes f3, g5. And this is how I win a queen. So that's why they have to block. But if they block, then we can deliver our next check. For example, this. So where does the king go? Anyway, so in both cases, the king is very vulnerable. For example, in this exact position, we can continue with queen f4 and win the rook. So if king g5, then queen e3 looks okay, but queen f4 then. That's why maybe just king g3 to play f4 with a pawn. So queen c7, still f4 with a pawn, and then the rook joins and there is a checkmate. Or you win the queen. Yeah, so looks like queen f6 as well as rook f2 doesn't look so well because they start the attack. So queen f4 is impossible. There is a queen covering this diagonal. What else? So rook b2. Well, I think rook b2 is very similar. So how do you continue the attack in this position? Let's play this move. No. Maybe yes. No, let's play this move first. The rook is hanging. This is a threat, which forces the king to go that way. So probably the rook moves. Doesn't matter where. Then you play queen e4. They play king f6. And in this position, you can just play rook here, threatening with... No, it's not a checkmate, actually. Okay, let's instead play this move and threaten with this check. It's likely to be winning. Okay, maybe they play rook to d2. Queen e4, king f6. Ah, they lose a rook simply. Okay, so rook b2 doesn't work neither. King g6 should be played in advance. So then the king always have this option to move back. You cannot use your queen to attack. Like, how? Because the king goes to h7. Once you play queen b6 or something like that, he goes back. Okay, did rook f2 blunder the same way? Let me check. So rook f2, here, here. I think it does. Well, what about king g3 just? There is queen b6 actually. Good point. Yes, thank you. But king g3 is also very attractive. Okay, so king g6 should be played, then king h3. Not a check, but king h3, bringing the king, avoiding these checks on this diagonal so that you can move the queen. Rook d3, let's say, king g3, protecting there. So step by step, you improve your position. And this endgame is actually winning. Why? Because this time they have to protect the pawn that way, and you simply bring the king and capture the pawn. You will gonna have two extra pawns, and that's why it is winning. So king g6 would provide black with better chances to draw the game, but still was completely losing if white plays properly. But queen f3 was a blunder. So rook h8, king goes that way, And after the next move, Viktor Korchnoi resigned. So could you please find a move that David Bronstein found it during the game? And how does this move work actually? Okay, one suggestion is Queen E8. And if King G5, the other suggestion is Queen B6. Well, Queen B6 I think is relatively safe because they can play Queen to F6. Okay, there is some tactics. I want you to find it. Okay, thanks. John found it. It's rook takes h6. How does this move work? So you remember the queen potentially is hanging in case if the rook no longer pins the g2 pawn. So if they capture with the king, you can play this. Doesn't matter where he goes. Let's say to g5, you can still play this move. And if he goes that way, you check and take the queen with your queen. If he goes that way, then there is g5 and you win the enemy queen. So the g4 pawn actually became very helpful. If they take with a pawn, it's a bit complicated, but still allows, well, it's actually not complicated. King f6 is the only square, and then you simply win the queen. Actually, I think it was possible for a grandmaster to calculate that rook h6 wins the game, and because of that, queen f3 doesn't work. He missed it. Fine, not a big issue, but he lost the game. And look at this position. Originally, it didn't look like a winning position. Originally, it looked like a draw. Black has to defend, but it seems that Black is able to hold the position. So here, the attack with limited forces on the enemy king was caused because of, well, this king's position is compromised. The g7 pawn can be attacked easily. And there was a second weakness on the other side. Because of the combination of these two factors, we were able to initiate the attack on the enemy king and kept in mind that in some variation we just win the pawn on the b file and two extra pawns are enough to win this endgame even if we have only rooks. And finally, there was a weakness of the back rank that white exploited. Yes, exactly. So Brian often, well, okay, let me just read the comment. I know about attacking with small forces. I do it in my games sometimes. It's not usually the best plan. Well, true. Well, to be honest, Brian is doing attack with small forces often, not sometimes. It happens often. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it works because of Brian's attacking skills and because his opponent's blunder. So this is how it works. Well, but usually attack with small forces can be parried. That's why you should understand when it does make sense to initiate such an attack or when it does make sense to focus on something else and come up with a different plan. Here, in this original position, it seems there is no other plan. What else you can do? Try to create a pass pawn, but with the queens on the board, your king is vulnerable. Try to attack this pawn, yes, but you can combine it with the kingside attack. That's why here, with queen g4 and rook a7 threats, you could play for a win. Now let's continue with the next example. Well, are we talking about the attack in this position? Who is attacking, by the way? So white has a rook and knight. Looks like they have material advantage, but how do they play for a win? This is a study-like combination, exactly. So we have the king. This king is in the center, so I don't think it's vulnerable at the moment, but we may make it vulnerable. So knight f2, what does it mean, knight f2? So white to move in this position. You mean black should play knight f1? Maybe. Rook d8, what's the purpose of rook d8? So yes, it's rook a2. The game should start with rook a2 move. Okay, so John suggests to restrict the king and set up tactics, and let's start with this move. But I think the king goes further then. So if you play this, you kind of do a restriction. But if he goes further, then he can cover with the pawn. So rook a2 makes a lot of sense. So that was a good suggestion. And here white exploits disharmony of black pieces. Because what then? If they play knight f1, king e1, and it seems they lose a bishop. So that's why after rook a2, it was bishop g1 played. But bishop g1 and we can play rook g2. This is a fork. There is nothing that can be done to save one of these pieces. However, black can try to trap the white rook. So king f3, rook g1. And now they play king f2. We have to move the rook to e1 and they start pushing the pawn. This is where your task is to decide how to play properly. Because black with small forces is trying to play e3, e2, which provokes your king move. And then they just play knight e4, chasing your king away from the rook and you lose a rook. Okay, so if you play knight f5 with the white knight, they just take it. Rook takes e4, and this is a theoretical draw. If you play a blitz game, maybe you can win it, but usually king and rook versus king and knight or king and bishop is a draw. So sacrificing the knight isn't a good idea. So what they want to achieve, they want, let me just explain. So this, they want to play this, and then they can play either knight e4 or knight f1. Maybe knight f1 is better. Knight f1, the king has to move further, the rook is captured, and now they are playing for win. King here. Well, I don't think they can because if we didn't spend these moves and brought our knight to the king side, I mean to the closer to the first rank, we would sacrifice the knight for that pawn at the very last moment, and that should be a draw. But I wanted you to understand what they are threatening. So e2 and then checks, which will distract the king from the protection of the rook. So knight f5 doesn't work, but what you can try instead? So king d2 now? No, king d2 now, e3 can be played instantly, and this is a check. And the pawn becomes poisoned because knight f1 is a fork. So e3. So king d2, e3, rook takes this. This is a draw. And the problem is that you cannot move the rook. Rook e2 is also not playable. Knight e6. Well, it seems that you have to play knight e6, but what about e3? How to play then? Bring it to d4? Okay, and if they play e2? I don't think you can play king d2 because of the same feature, knight f1 or knight e4. So it seems that you can take it, right? So let's calculate this line. Knight d4, e2, knight takes on e2, and what do you think black can play? Yes, Dan is absolutely correct. It's knight f1. Let me show you how it works. So knight d4, e2. So not capturing means knight f1, for example, and then king takes e1, and at least it's a draw. That's why it should be captured. Capturing with a rook guarantees a draw. So knight takes e2 and knight f1. Look at this super move. White has no useful moves. If they move the king, they lose their rook. So they have to play with a knight. Now they play with the knight, for example, there, and it's a repetition. Knight to e3, king d2, knight f1. So once the king comes there, the rook is lost. If they take, it's still a draw. That's why not knight d4. Another suggestion was knight g5. Okay, how does knight g5 works? They play this move, king goes there to protect the rook, and then knight f1. And you have to move the rook and leave your rook hanging. So this, and this is losing. So you can deliver one more check, but he escapes. Well, so you're right, it's a knight move, but where exactly to move your knight and why? So Hunter suggests knight c5. Brian suggests knight d8. Brian, I think knight d8 is too far from the place of action. Don't you think so? Hunter, may I know what's your rating is? Do you have a FIDE rating or only national one, or maybe you have a one on chess.com? Oh, okay. So great. Knight c5 is correct. Can you please explain why this move is correct and what happens in case if e2 is played? So e2, king d2, knight f1, and what white prepared. Well, knight e4 check. No, the king is under check. Come on, guys. The king is under check. So white should either take or move the king. King c2, and the answer is no. Well, rook takes knight, you lose the game. So this, no more checks, you're likely to lose the knight. Uh, King c2, knight checks, and then king takes e1. If this move, then knight c4, and then king takes e1. That's why only king c1 works. Why only king c1 works? So now, in case if they decide to take our rook, we checkmate with knight d3, luckily because this knight is on f1 and blocks the king from escaping. So, for example, in case of king c2, it's knight e3, and after king c1, it is not checkmate because the king escapes. But in if we move king to c1 right away, then this leads to checkmate because the knight is still there. If they play something else, for example, what? Knight e3, then knight d3. Same thing with knight g3, knight d3. So king goes that way, and in this position, let's play this move first. f2 is unavailable, and our next move can be this. Oh, well, it's actually looks like it is a Zugzwang. So, for example, what happens if the knight moves? If the knight moves to where? F1. So you can play this threatening to take. That's why they have to retreat. But then you still take. They take with their knight, and you play this. If they don't take with their knight, but for example, play this move, you can just come closer and defend it. And then play with your knight anywhere, so your rook has enough freedom. For example, knight f5. No, knight f5, king d2 first, and then you move the rook. Okay, fine. So knight e3, knight d3, king f3, and rook h1. And you can use this square for your knight. And then you bring the king closer. So it's completely winning. But in case of king c1, it's this. Okay, so look at this original position where finally white captured the bishop. Look at black piece's activity. These three pieces can together create an attack on the enemy king with just a few pieces. So it's very small forces. However, it can be successful. In this exact variation, it's not, but due to the only moves that white could find. So they could counterattack with other small forces and even deliver a checkmate with one knight, getting the enemy king blocked with his own pieces. Yes, exactly, Brian. So this is a study-like combination. It didn't happen in the game. Just one position to illustrate. All other positions are taken from the game. So this is also a game. Bernstein was played against someone. It's not a study-like combination. It looks like a study-like combination, but it's not. So this is a practical game, but it looks like a study. Black is a pawn up, but their king is severely restricted on the edge, allowing white to find the winning combination. What would you do? Okay, Roshan suggests through knight c8. Chester suggests c5, a4 or c5 and knight c4, and Hunter suggests c5. So Hunter, in which country do you want to participate in your first tournament? Because it doesn't seem that you are 1000. It seems that you are quite an experienced player. Okay, so first of all, you should understand which pieces are in the United States. Okay, great. First of all, you should understand that how exactly you deliver a checkmate. Which of your pieces delivers a checkmate? Well, when the king is there and it doesn't have any squares, it's likely to be your knight. So your knight can check from b7 or from c4. You cannot reach b7 because there is enemy knight covering this position, this square. So it can be c4. In order to play c4, you have to play c5. But the problem is that once you play c5, you let the king to go to b5 in case of knight c4. However, the b5 square can be covered with a4, so it's not a big issue. Moreover, probably if you decide to play c5, you then should continue with this move and only then continue with knight c4. Or depends on the position, depends on how black plays. Maybe a different order works too. What else? So when you play c5, you have to consider b5. What do you think we should play after this move? a4? Okay, so then, yes, you've suggested a very nice line, but the problem is that they may not take on c5, but continue with b5. Okay, so there is a suggestion of playing a4. We will talk about this move a little later. Okay, so looks like there are no suggestions after c5, so let's talk about a4. Okay, so playing a4, how does it help? What if, for example, they play b5? This is not checkmate. So c5, but then b takes a4. And then how do you checkmate? You can play king c4, trying to force the knight to move, and then you win with knight b7. But they won't move their knight. Instead, they'll push the pawn. So if you come closer to take this pawn, then they are allowed to play with a knight already. And if you deliver this check, the king successfully goes to b5. You don't have pieces to cover it because your king is tied down to the pawn since you sacrifice it. So a4, b5, maybe let's take first, but then they take with the a and the king gets another safe square to escape. That's why it's unlikely to be checkmate. So it seems a4 doesn't work after b5. So the king always escapes. So you cannot attack these two squares with your knight. It's impossible. That's why a4 doesn't work. So let's talk about Brian's plan. c5, b5, knight c8. Well, and what are you threatening with knight c8? For example, knight e6. I take him there. Okay, good point. But you should start with c5. So, well, for example, this is a simple checkmate that everyone can calculate. If this move, then this is a simple checkmate that you can also find. It's findable. But in case of b5, here John suggests to play a3. There is no knight c4. That's why we want knight b7. In order to play knight b7, we should let them to play with their knight. So now if they play with their knight, it's over. Do they have any other moves instead of a knight move? Well, only a pawn move, which this time is a blunder too, because a takes b4 is a check, which doesn't allow the king to escape. So this is how the game ended. Well, a3 was a critical move. c5 was possible to calculate, but after b5, it's not clear how exactly you continue the attack. But with a3, you have this opportunity. Now, if b4 you take, in case if not, then knight b7 is your next move. Okay, so the attack here was initiated only because of the vulnerability of the enemy king, which was stuck on the edge, and it was not clear how the king gets new escape squares to avoid checkmating that. So that's why here we based our uh, attack on creating a mating net. Okay, let's continue. Let's take a look at this position. Black is a pawn up, but white is about to capture on h5, and after capturing this pawn, at least the white's position will be equal. However, black may quickly begin the attack on the enemy king. And this is their only chance to play for a win. Otherwise, they just lose a pawn and the game ends in a draw. because usually two bishops are stronger than two knights. But if you take advantage of the king's vulnerability, because now the king doesn't have many squares, only this, e4 is poisoned because then it's knight c5. Can you please stop drawing? So, because every time you draw, I need to delete it. So 97 to capture there. Okay, it does make sense. Mhm. So, well, 97. Okay, let's play this move. For example, I think that the game may continue with something like that and then bishop e5. There is also a second suggestion, playing this. But then it's b6. However, then it's this. But then it's this, and I don't know. It seems black is better because c4 pawn is lost. And where does this bishop go? If it goes to h3, there is no attack on h5. If it goes to a4, then we capture with a temper. So this looks fine. But if they first capture on d7, then what? Let's say rook takes or king takes probably. King takes to keep attacking there. Then it's this, this, and this. And it should be equal. I don't think it's possible to win the pawn on a3. It's possible to create a pin, but it's just a pin. For example, this and bishop f6 or bishop f4. Or even king e4 was better. Okay, fine. So 97 doesn't look so promising. What else do we have? Brian suggests b5, taking advantage of this, maybe. b5. So b5, c takes b5. Then what? A takes b5, bishop takes. And where do you move the knight to create discovered attack? If this move, it's bishop takes. Looks like b5 is not promising neither. Remember, the attack on the enemy king. This is what we study at today's class. e4 and knight f6. Well, e4 can be played right away. Why? Because the pawn is poisoned. Well, f5 was also a suggestion, but they take on h5, guys. If you play something else, they take on h5. Let's say you play f5, they take on h5, and what then? Yes, you can play this move, but how do you benefit of it? And f5 is now vulnerable. So e4, the pawn is poisoned. In case of king f4, this. In case of king e2, it's knight c5, and then you take this pawn. So they can take on h5, but you can take on c4 um, with your knight, I think. With your knight, yes. And if rook d5, b5 works. Check. I don't know what for, just this move. Bishop b4 check, you can go further, maybe to f6. So you are still a pawn up and continue your attack. That's why they played king f4 to attack these pawns. So one with rook, one with king, but later when knight c5 won't be a possibility. Knight goes to e7, opening and threatening with this. So that's why white continued with bishop a5. So if they take there, it's knight g6, king goes somewhere, then rook c4 is a double attack. Well, and this double attack works well because after this move, it's b6. No, b6 maybe doesn't work. Mm. Well, I think white should be fine here. Well, what do you mean? Take on d7, then take on a5. Instead, they take on b6. No, actually, rook h5 was fine, but they played bishop a5 in the game first, and then they got b6 and then bishop d7. But as I said, bishop b takes a5, and now this is vulnerable, and the bishop doesn't know where to move. So bishop h3 blocks this attack. Bishop a4 falls under rook c4. However, this time rook c4, bishop b3, and f7 is hanging. Well, but you can play this move, and if they take, you play this. Knight g6, yeah, knight g6 seems to be better move, and then rook f7. Oh, yeah, that's right. And then the h5 pawn is poisoned. Is it? No, it's not. So looks like it's still a draw. Could try rook b5 or where? No. Well, okay, knight g6 first. Let's include this move first. He goes that way, rook c5, check, we protect on h5, king f6, and we protect on f7 too. So we don't take on c4, but we keep both pawns alive. Yeah, rook c5, exactly. This is what happened in the game. So if this, you have knight g4 with a discovered attack. If not, if, for example, well, what else they can do? Well, they played bishop b3 in the game. Let's protect the pawn on f7. And it's still possible to draw the game for white in this position, but can you please find this only move which guaranteed a draw? Well, not guaranteed, but would likely lead to a draw. Which move I'm talking about? What do you think white should play? F4? F4 and passant. Rook d1? What's the purpose of rook d1? Rook d1, I think knight g4 check, then knight takes f2. a4, I think knight g4, knight takes f2 still. Bishop a4, king f8, bishop b3. What's the difference? Why? Well, I think the king on f8 is stronger than the king on e8. The king on f8 is threatening with this, which is a checkmate, isn't it? So then if you do like that and then you retreat with the bishop, you are checkmated. Actually, this becomes a threat. Rook g1 doesn't help if you play so. This becomes a threat, and then the king is vulnerable to checkmate. That's why the only way to play for the king is to go to f5 right away. So they should let the king escape. They should provide the king with multiple squares. So, for example, in case of knight c4, it cannot be this because of knight d2 and knight b3. It should be king f4. But then it's possible to survive. So, for example, knight a3, rook a1, these pawns are doubled. And because the pawns are not connected, white has drawing chances. Again, it's not clear, and maybe I won't make a draw if I were playing this with white pieces, but it should be. This is the only way to save the game. King f5, knight d3, for example, take knight f2. He goes that way, this. King f. Well, it can be a draw too. Looks like there are two extra pawns, but the king is active enough. This is +2, exactly. But in fact, it's +1 because these are doubled and this is lost. With the king being close to the h-pawn, I think that yeah, white stops it. Okay, should be a draw, actually. So neither a knight c4 nor knight d3 works, but I like knight c4 more in this position. King g7 was played. They made this king move, and this is how they lost the game, knight g4. Threatening with rook g5, which ties the king to the corner. So probably they could try this, but this is still a losing position. Rook g5, king h7. So if you go that way, they play this. And the idea of bishop c2 was to stop rook g6, which could be a checkmate if not the bishop. That's why just, what, h4, and after rook takes h4, king goes that way. Threatening with knight f6. No, threatening with rook g7, knight f6, and rook g8. What did happen in the game? Instead, yeah, there is still rook g8, but you would better first check and force the king to go to h8. So they played rook d1, rook g5, king h8, and knight goes to f6 with rook g8 threat. So this time, if they played there, it is a forced checkmate, or like that. So king h8, knight f6, threatening with this. This is what they couldn't stop. They can deliver a check. What do you think? Where to move your king? To f8 or to e7? Two options. F8 doesn't lose, but allows them to play rook d8 and protect the g8 square with their rook. And you fail with your mating idea. That's why king s7, exactly. So now they can play this, but they lose a rook in such a case. This move is unstoppable. Okay, so this is how the game ended. Well, you may say that how can we figure out that we can initiate the attack on the enemy king? Well, you actually don't have to do this at this early stage of the game. At this early stage of the game, you should understand what your task is. You should activate your pieces, and you can do it through e5, for example, and you see that once you push the pawn on e4, it's a poisoned pawn, and you then have chances to capture there, maybe attack both bishops or at least one and compensate a loss of h5. But once the king goes to f5 and you play this move, then definitely you should be looking of how to checkmate such a king. Here it's obvious that there can be an attack. At least knight a5 saves both pawns. And then you threaten with this, which allows you to bring the rook and create a mating net. But even if you don't win with such a mating net, um, at least you can take other benefits of this position. For example, as we discussed, in this position, in order to get the king escape, they have to play this and fall under a discovered attack. And I'm sure that finding such a move like king f5, which by the first glance seems like a blunder, will be so hard for your opponent. That's why he could play something else and lose with this, or just play king g7 and again lose with knight g4, rook g5 like it happened in the game. Okay, fine. We have one more example. This is the last game, the game between Rashid Najmedinov against Shalom Matskevich. And well, Rashid was known as a famous attacker. However, before we continue with the analysis of our last game, let me remind you. So I would like to remind you that my workshops are free, but if you would like to donate, well, if you like them and if you want to support, you can donate using this button. This donation works through PayPal. Let me send you the link here. How does it work? You click the button, then you enter the amount you want to donate, and then you click this PayPal. It redirects you to enter your PayPal account. You enter and transfer money automatically to my PayPal account. There is also a feature to transfer money through Wise. especially if you have wise, it's probably a more simple way to do. And one more thing for you to remember. We started our Endgame training course. So it's a series of group lessons, 12 group lessons. They are live and they happen on Fridays at 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. So if you live in New York or in Eastern seaside of the United States, then we start at 5 for you. For Europeans, it's either 10 p.m. if they live, for example, in London. For like Central Europe, it's 11 p.m., which is a bit late, I understand. But well, I'm sure at least one day a week you can go to bed later because the next day is a official is a weekend. So well, people sometimes work on Saturdays, but not often. What are we studying in this course? So it's not too late to join. We had one class passed last Friday. However, if you join now, you get the recording of the previous class as well as the homework, so you can catch up. These are the topics that we are covering. So almost all in games are covered, and the next one will be devoted to pawn in games. So the next class, then advanced pawn in games, rook in games, and so on. So my recommendation is to join it, especially once you see how affordable it is. Let's say, for example, you pay monthly, $49 per month, and it's even less than $10 per hour. Okay, fine. So, let me send you the link if you want to enroll. Again, if you cannot attend these events, it's not a big issue. You can just watch the recordings. Of course, I recommend at least sometimes to join live sessions, but if you cannot, at least you can watch the recordings and do the homework, and because of that, improve your ability to play the end games. Okay, fine. Our last example. Am I sharing the screen? Looks like not. Okay, so it may seem that this position, because it's the position with bishops of opposite color and limited material, is likely to be a draw. But black may have two active ideas. Who can say? Who can tell me what active ideas I'm talking about? So because of which factors black can play for a win? Black has a passed pawn. Good point. But one passed pawn in the endgames with bishops of opposite color usually is not enough. White king is vulnerable. So yes, it is potentially vulnerable. That's exactly one of the ideas. Okay, so looks like I taught you to look for mate in net. In even in the end games, once only a few pieces left on the board. So it can be two passed pawns. That's right, Brian. That's absolutely right. So which I can rephrase your sentence. You probably mean that we can combine the idea of attacking the enemy king with the idea of winning the pawn on a4. In such a case, we are likely to have two passed pawns and most likely we win the game. So which move to start with? Bishop d4, like Peter suggested. Is possible, but doesn't look so attractive. C5, and then they play A5, A6, so they are able to protect both. What they need is to bring the king closer. But bishop e3 is a better move. How does it work? For example, if king goes to h5, it's what it can be what? Rook here, 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 and you take the pawn. Or it can be even check there. King goes that way, and you play rook a2, and now you take the pawn with a check. So that's why king g7. And we remember, because of the previous example, that the king on g7 is vulnerable. Last time we checkmated with rook and knight. This time we have bishop and rook. So king e7, protecting the pawn. f4. Not clear what for, but, well, maybe it restricts the bishop. Rook h2. How should they play? Well, obviously, if they take on c6, they lose the game. Rook e1 to pin was played in the game. We are going to talk about it. So how does bishop c6 loses? So yeah, bishop d4, king goes there, and rook h8. So this is also a similar check, very common checkmate. That's why they decided to pin rook g2. King goes that way, and with king f6, we can unpin and threaten checkmate. What would happen if the king goes that way? Who can tell me? King f8. That's right. King f8, and we're still threatening with a mate. And if they now escape, we win the second pawn with a check. And with two pawns, we should be winning. So king h6. King goes to f6, threatening with this. King goes to h7. Now the bishop is hanging because rook h2 is not checkmate. The king escapes to g8. So we have to save the bishop. But they play rook h1 to prevent all these checks. What then? What do you suggest? And by the way, I have a question for you guys. Why didn't we just capture the pawn? Isn't it better to take the pawn for free? They can pin the bishop. True. But king f5. Oh, now they can take on c6. And it's still one extra pawn only. So bishop d2 because of that. Rook h1. So this is now hanging. That's why rook g7. If he goes that way, we take here and then win a rook. So that's why after rook g7, he has to go to h8 only. The white king is cut off. And but black should understand, black shouldn't exchange the rooks. If black does it, it's likely to be a draw anyway. This pawn is hanging. What would you suggest? Yeah, c5 to keep it alive. I absolutely agree, because what they can do? Well, if they deliver these, check, then their f4 pawn is lost. Rook g6. And after rook takes rook, the f4 pawn is lost. And with two pawns, we're definitely winning because they are located in the distance. Also, the enemy king is too far from the place of action, so it's an easy win. So king h7, bishop f4. So that's why they played rook h5. bishop a3 defending the pawn, bishop a4. So they're threatening with something like that. Now what? We don't want to get the king. We don't want to provide the king with more squares, but at the same time, we are likely to lose a rook. Yes, it's bishop d4, exactly. So now if the check is delivered, it's not a big issue. So we simply move our king to e6 or maybe to somewhere else, like e7. And then we threaten with a discovered attack, which allows us to win material. For example, if they play this move, then such a discovered attack, it cannot be this because they take on d4. Oh no, it can be this. It can be this. And we are about to win here. And if they take there, it's intermediate check, after which we capture on d4 and win this in game. So that's why they played rook
Victor, what if
d5.
he checked on h6 rather than f5? So we had the bishop on e4. Now, couldn't he check on h6 here and win the rook?
No, it's protected.
Ah, got it. Okay, yeah.
When pawn on c5 was attacked, why not playing c4 instead of defending it with the bishop? So like that. No, I don't think it's a mistake, first of all. Well, but they can play rook c5. And the purpose of this move is a double attack. So it looks like a mistake, actually. I mean, c4 looks like a mistake because if you play c4, it's rook c5, so they threaten to win a rook and they threaten to win a pawn. And if you play this move, then this, they're attacking your bishop. So you cannot make a discovered attack. You can, but it's actually only this move. So protecting it. But then the king move, oh, it's even not a check, actually. Oh, still king h7. So this, threatening the mate. Yeah, seems to work. So in this position, king h7 was a wrong move. I didn't need to play it. I can play this move because it stops rook h3. So king h7, I go that way. It's not checkmate. Okay, so probably that's why sacrificing the pawn on c4 isn't a good idea. So that's why let's get this pawn protected with bishop e3 and then bishop d4. Rook d5, rook g4 was played. So we are threatening with king a7, rook here, and rook h8 mate. For example, let me illustrate it. Check, another check, and then checkmate. So that's why they have to go that way. And after rook f4, white decided to resign because there is no compensation for two pawns. Moreover, white can make a move with their king and deliver a check. That's why white should be accurate. So, for example, something like that means that they lose the game. That's why the bishop should move to on this diagonal. But it's still a losing position. So I don't know how to play, but let's find. Here, bishop f4. Okay, here, bishop f4, then a king a6 check, king moves, and then f5. Something like that. And then with the king, you are trying to promote pawns. It should be winning. Okay, so this is how the game was won. After rook f4, he simply resigned. Yes. Well, sometimes you need three pieces to attack, and here you even attack with four, because this pawn plays an important role, not allowing the king to escape to g6 very often when the king is on f8 or e7. But for example, if you have a queen, you may need just two pieces, your knight or your bishop and a queen. So you protect your queen with bishop, and your queen delivers checkmate. This is the most common scenario. So with a knight, there are also a lot of winning combinations, but if it comes to the end game, then yes, you need multiple pieces, at least three. Knight and rook, and a pawn at least, or bishop, rook, and pawn. Fine. So what I want you to remember, well, I don't want you to initiate an attack with small forces every time you just want to attack. You should initiate such an attack only in cases if there are certain preconditions. For example, here the king is not where it should be and can be potentially checkmated. And you combine the idea of delivering check to the king with something else. With the idea of winning a pawn, for example, or like with the idea of advancing your pawns. Here, we wanted to win one of these two pawns. And together with this, we were attacking the king. In the previous example, we were almost doing the same feature. We were trying to activate our pieces by obtaining the e5 square, protecting the h5 pawn, and capturing the one on c4. And once the king entered our camp to capture our pawns, then only we could initiate the attack on that king. So this is what you should do. You should identify whether there is a good moment for you to attack with small forces. If it's not, then come up with a different plan. And don't always attack. So don't think that attack is a universal plan. No, it's not. Look at the king, look at other factors, and decide. If usually in the end game, we don't attack the king, but we attack enemy pawn weaknesses and try to occupy weak squares into the enemy territory to improve our pieces. And all this is done in order to create passed pawn and to promote them, or at least tie enemy pieces down to our passed pawns. Okay, so we are done for today. Those of you who are interested in the Improve Your Endgame course, the link was sent to you, I think. Yes, exactly. Also, if you have any questions, you can message me. You can message me at tricksofchess@gmail.com, especially if you're looking for private coaching or if you would like to work in a group. Um, so the next workshop will be next Friday. During this week, I'm going to stream how I'm going to participate in the Title Tuesday, but if the chess.com's browser is working slowly, then I will just play games online with not Title Tuesday, just any random opponent. What else? I'm going to play Rapid with you guys if you want on Thursdays. I will make an announcement at Chesslands Club on chess.com and a group lesson on Friday and then a webinar on Sunday. So this is our plan for the week. Thank you for coming. So I appreciate your donation. So hope to see you next Sunday. Bye bye.